Thank you, friends, and thanks for that introduction for the upcoming gathering. For now, I want to introduce us to the Friday Evening Plenary. My name is Kira Wilson, and I'm one of the co-clerks for this year's gathering. The Friday Evening Plenary invites an intentional unsettling of usual Quaker paradigms. Historically, we have drawn our collective identity and pride from stories centered in Anglo, white, Christian, settler-centric narratives. This evening, we invite in an intentional inverting that centers the other along many lines of place, language, history, and community. Syed Atshan is a Palestinian Quaker and graduate of Ramallah Friends School and Swarthmore College. He received his doctorate in anthropology and Middle Eastern studies from Harvard University. He has taught courses on social movements and human rights in the Middle East and the Arab Spring, and introductions to peace and justice studies. He has won numerous awards and fellowships and works with a wide range of organizations to find practical solutions to conflicts. He has also conducted research into the struggle for peace through nonviolent resistance in Palestine. Syed is currently an associate professor in the Peace and Conflict Studies Department and a coordinator of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program at Swarthmore College and an associate professor of anthropology at Emory University. Margaret Jacobs is the Charles Mock Professor of History and the director of the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is of settler background and collaborates with Rosebud Lakota journalist Kevin Abarusk on the Reconciliation Rising, a multimedia project that showcases Indigenous people and settlers who are working together to honestly confront painful and traumatic histories, promote meaningful and respectful dialogue between natives and non-natives, and create pathways to reconciliation. Through Reconciliation Rising, Kevin and Margaret have produced a podcast and an 11-minute film, Return of the Pawnees. They are working on an hour-long documentary called The Land Returns. Margaret is also the co-founder and director of the Genoa Indian School Digital Reconciliation Project at UNL. This project locates and makes available all the government records related to the Genoa School as an act of archival reconciliation, of bringing history home to tribal nations. The project aims to support descendant communities in telling more complete stories of Genoa and to promote awareness and truth-seeking about the boarding schools among all Americans. Margaret has published more than 35 articles and 4 books, primarily about the US government's policy and practices of Indigenous child removal and family separation for over a century. She published After 100 Winters: In Search of Reconciliation on Americans' Stolen Land with Princeton University Press in 2021. Thank you, Syed. Thank you, Margaret, for both sharing a little bit about your perspective and what draws you into this, this kind of work. We're going to move into the opportunity for Syed and Margaret to ask each other questions. And as our speakers have this opportunity to have a kind of conversation, we also want to invite audience members interested in asking questions to send questions to Rebecca, our co-clerk for this year's gathering and Q&A moderator. And she'll work to compile that and then offer questions to Syed and Margaret as a closing part of our Q&A. But for now, I would like to pass it back to Margaret to think about the questions you might want to ask Syed in his work as well.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Kira, and thank you, Syed. I loved listening to your presentation and seeing those beautiful photographs. And gosh, so many things came up for me listening to your talk. I think our audience members may think, well, what in the world does a scholar who works on Palestine have in common with a scholar who works on Indigenous peoples in the United States? But I saw so many similarities. And one of them I was thinking about is how you talk about Christianity has been a tool of empire, but it's also been a tool that Indigenous peoples and Palestinians, the Indigenous peoples of your land, have used and seized upon as a way as a liberatory practice. So that was really, really interesting to think about. Another thing I thought about was the word practice and the need for us to develop a practice. And, that's something that it didn't occur to me immediately when I was doing this kind of work. But, as I've continued in this work, it's become so important to me because I think there is a kind of misconception that, okay, there's going to be a big apology. Oh, and then maybe there'll be some reparations. And then people will stop talking about this. They'll get over it. They'll move on. You hear those get over it and move on. But for me, it's really become clear that this is an ongoing, lifelong, multi-generational practice of decolonization or reconciliation or whatever you might want to call it. And it's both a kind of collective practice and an individual practice. So my question, I'm finally getting to a question, is what is your particular practice of decolonization? Or is that the term you prefer? Would you ever use the term reconciliation?
Thank you so much, Margaret. You're so generous. And let me just say that I absolutely loved reading your book, your most recent book, After 100 Winters. And I highly recommend that friends read it. And the Kindle version was very easy for me to access from Palestine. But also I'm excited that there's an audiobook version as well. So there's all these different formats. It's just beautifully written, and you captured, I think, some of the horror and the cruelty, and I was moved by, the experiences of the Ponca nation and their removal. And, it just, you captured a lot of really heart-wrenching material, but also the prose is so beautiful. And there's a message of hope as well, and a message of that we can hold on to, what we can actually do to ameliorate these conditions. So thank you for writing that book and for your voice and your witness. And I highly, highly recommend the book. And so you, of course, you talk a lot about reconciliation alongside decolonization. And I think coupling those two is absolutely invaluable. And that resonates with me very deeply. And it reminds me of sort of how so many Palestinian Quakers and Palestinian Christians combine the notions of peace and justice. And for me, I'm troubled when I see, social justice warriors who are like, justice, justice, and are angry. And I'm angry, we have the right to be angry. But how do we channel our anger in constructive ways? If we're not doing it from a place of love and kindness and compassion, we can reproduce the toxicity that we aim to be, trying to resist in the first place. But at the same time, if all we do is call for, peace and love and kindness and compassion without a, commitment to justice at the same time, then those are just mere platitudes. And so I really, really love how you bring together decolonization and reconciliation. I think it's a way to really embody that commitment to peace and justice together. That's such a powerful combination. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting point, Syed, about anger. I think that's where a lot of social justice movements start. We get angry because something is so outrageous and so awful, whether it's George Floyd's murder or the murder of the journalist you just talked about, and the way in which the authorities were attacking the people at her funeral. I mean, so those things make us so mad, and those can be great to sort of get us going, but I don't think that anger is a place where we can dwell very long. And I've always been really moved by, the Martin Luther King Jr. concept of the beloved community. The way I understood that as a historian studying the civil rights movement was that activists wanted to create a community among themselves that mirrored the world they wanted to live in. And I think that is so important because it's so easy to get overwhelmed and depressed by all these horrific, violent events and all the hatred, all the fear. So I find it so important to find community with people who have a shared vision or are working toward a shared vision that's based on love and creating a thriving society for everybody. So I feel like anger might get me going, but it's that vision of a larger, better world that keeps me doing things and propels me. I wonder how you think about those things too.
Absolutely. You know, for me, I felt for many years now that if I let the anger consume me, and if I let the anger sort of, you know, take over my heart, you know, and take over my spirit, then the colonial project has prevailed, you know, because it's, you know, they can take, you know, they can take our land, they can take our natural resources, they can, you know, oppress our bodies. But we are the owners, we are the keepers of our spirits, of our souls, of our minds, of our hearts. And no one can take that away from me or us. And so, you know, I try to hold on to that with every fiber of my being, so that the, you know, the colonial project doesn't, you know, ultimately prevail. And that's, you know, and people may disagree with me, and that's okay. But this is just my own personal ethos.
Mhm.
Margaret, I'd love to, you know, ask you a few questions. I actually have many questions. But the first is, you know, earlier you alluded to the fact that, you know, for many Native American indigenous communities in North America, they've experienced Christianity as a product of colonialism and imperialism, as a tool for oppression and erasure of identity, you know, etc., and cultural genocide in many ways. But then you also mentioned that for other Native folks, Christianity has been a tool for a kind of liberatory, emancipatory self-actualization. And I was wondering if perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on this point that you just raised a minute ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this because I've done a lot of work on the Indian boarding schools, that this might be the place to talk about that because, for example, there is a school, I believe it's on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, the Ogallala Lakota Reservation in South Dakota, called Red Cloud Indian School. And it's been in existence for a very long time, and it was run by the Catholic Church. And you know, if you followed anything that's been going on in Canada with their boarding schools, which they called residential schools, you know that there was widespread sexual abuse in the schools by religious authorities. You know, they've found mass graves at these schools. So, I mean, it was very tough for a lot of Native children to go through the schools, whether they were run by the federal government or whether they were run by Christian denominations. Even those that were run as supposedly secular schools still had a really strong religious education. So you hear Indigenous people talking about how painful that could be. But on the other hand, now Red Cloud Indian School is now it's like a college preparatory academy for Native kids, run almost entirely by other Native people who themselves embrace Catholicism and find great solace and great power in the church. So, for example, I met a man named Maka Black Elk who teaches at the Red Cloud Indian School. And he's engaged in these reconciliation processes with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is you know, working closely with them to apologize for some of the practices that they engaged in that were so demeaning to Indigenous peoples. But you know, they're also, you know, reclaiming a lot of their heritage, their language. They're teaching the language instead of trying to stomp it out in the school as they once had. So I think that's a really interesting example of the way that it could be used as a weapon, but it's now been seized by a lot of Indigenous people. Christianity has been seized as a liberatory tool that is not at odds with also practicing their religious traditions.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I'd love to learn more about this. And Maybe I'll ask one more question, and because I know that there will be questions from the audience as well. But so I noticed in your book that the term restorative justice came up a number of times, and it's a term that I use in my own scholarship as well.
Yes,
and
I saw it in here.
And you link restorative justice to other concepts, but also to apologies and a kind of recognition for sins of the past, as well as the need for reparations. And I was just curious if you could share with us a little bit more about this particular term and its salience for you analytically, theoretically, ethnographically, in your work and beyond.
Oh, wow, that'd be so fun. I hope someday we get to meet in person and have like a long dinner where we can really talk about that. I think of restorative justice. I mean, so many people use it in very many different ways, but I think of it as a term to help us conceptualize a form of justice that's a collective form of justice. I mean, I think when we usually talk about the justice system or the law, we think about somebody has experienced a wrong and they can sue somebody, go to court and gain some sort of justice, or there's a victim of violence and the perpetrator is tried for a crime. But when it comes to Indigenous peoples, the scale of violence, the scale of the crimes was so vast, and it happened over such a long time that it's really impossible to kind of break it down by each individual. So restorative justice is meant, I think, to be a way in which both those who've been victimized and have survived horrific crimes can gain some sort of collective healing and justice, but also those who perpetrated those crimes and who descended from the perpetrators or who benefited from those crimes have also a role to play in repairing those harms and in taking responsibility for those harms. So I think of it as this very dynamic process in which people are engaged in trying to collectively looking at the past and collectively trying to repair it. And as you mentioned, I see it involving what you might call symbolic things. Sometimes people just dismiss some symbolic things as, oh, that doesn't mean anything. But those include like apologies, memorials, declarations and statements. And then they also, a lot of restorative justice in my mind also includes what you consider to be like walking the walk and action and not just talk. But in the case of Roger Welsh, giving back land, making some sort of compensation for those who've been wronged in the past, what we would call reparations, or making available funds for a healing fund that can be used by Indigenous peoples to try to restore their communities, their languages, and to overcome some of the traumas that they've experienced. So I think it's a great term. I did notice, Syed, that in your book, The Moral Triangle, that you also use the term restorative justice, and I'm really eager to read your book. I haven't had a chance yet, but again, I think there's just a lot of things that we have in common that I can't wait to continue our conversation someday.